Monday, December 19th, and this is Geeknights. Our podcast went for 80 minutes, so we kind of cut out the news bits and we went straight into part 2 of our continuing What to Choose for a Computer series. Fair.
All right, things of the day. So this is a auction on eBay, and it's an auction for something that if I had money enough, I would have been bidding on this, and I would have bid until I got it.
I have enough money, but it's still way too much.
I think it'd be worth it. If I had this much disposable income, I'd be there.
Yeah.
But Teller of Penn & Teller fame is auctioning off brunch, with himself
It's breakfast.
in his house with a mouse.
No mouse.
Well, no mouse. But he'll cook you brunch, and you can hang out with him in his house all day, and he'll show you all the neat magic-y trick things he has in his house. Like he has a table with a skeleton in it that screams, and he has a magic mirror wall, and just all this cool stuff, and you get to hang out with him. Hear his voice.
We should auction off brunch at our house.
Yeah, maybe we'll get $5.
Dude, sweet.
Now, this auction is already at about $1,500, and I think it's going to get a lot higher than that before this ends.
Well, I think there were so many seats, and they already auctioned off all the seats.
This is the last seat.
This is the last seat, so it's going to go for a higher price than the previous seats.
But it's actually, the reason they're doing this is the James Randi Educational Foundation is ramping up for their The Amazing Meeting, which is this conference they do. And a lot of cool people are there. Like the people from, Penn & Teller are there, and James Randi is there. The Mythbusters are usually there, and a bunch of other really cool, famous science-type people. And this is a charity event, this brunch, and the money is going to go right to the JREF.
Sweet.
Except for $25 of it, which will go toward the food that Teller will cook you.
Because Teller can't afford the food.
Yeah.
Because, he's so poor living in his mansion.
The funny thing is, you don't get to pick what he cooks. He's going to cook whatever he wants.
Hopefully he won't, bleed all over it or something with some magic blood.
I'm just curious what his voice sounds like.
I know what his voice sounds like.
I heard him go, ah, once in the background or something.
You can go online and find out what he sounds like fairly easily.
Well, perhaps I shall do that.
I'm not 100% sure of that, but I'm 99% sure of it. So if you can't find it, then don't yell at me.
But you're the one who suggested it.
It's because the internet has everything. The odds of it not being there are much less than the odds of it being there.
Yeah. So what do you got?
Well, Phoenix Wright, the awesome DS GBA lawyer game.
Yep.
Well, in that game, you're Phoenix Wright, this lawyer who has a fondness for objecting and then pointing dramatically.
Yeah, by dramatic, we mean hit the table, swing the arm around in the air, there's flashing lights, and then you point.
And then he objects.
Yeah.
So someone took that little animation out of the game and put it in Flash, and you can basically type text in a box and choose what Phoenix Wright says, and you can make him say anything.
So totally, every time I argue with anyone on the internet ever, Phoenix is going to be backing me up.
Yeah, if you ever needs a lawyer to say something, just type it in this box, click the button, send someone the link, they'll click on it, and they'll see Phoenix pointing at them dramatically and then saying whatever you want him to say. Like, you are totally wrong. See, look, someone agrees with me. A lawyer agrees with me.
Of course, the first, 4 things you typed into it to show me your thing of the day were various obscenities and poop jokes.
Duh. Any person in the world would type that in first. What else would you type in?
Yeah, just like when the DS first came out. I think the first thing 98% of males who had a DS drew was a penis of some variety.
Don't lay off. The females also drew peni.
Yeah, you know what? Everyone drew peni. Multiple webcomics make jokes about it.
It used to be in when I was in elementary school, drawing boobies was the thing. Now it's all drawing peni. What's up with that?
Wonder why. In fact, just because I thought of it, in the latest VG Cats today, just a normal, funny VG Cats comic, but there's a starscape in the background, and it shows one constellation. And I'll give you one guess what that constellation was in the shape of.
Oh my God, Lowell Barbecue.
Yeah. So, moving on. We started a series last Monday. Actually, we started it during last Monday's podcast when it came to our attention that this was a good idea. A continuous series on how to buy or build a computer.
Yep. And some people didn't believe us, what we were saying last week, and how a $500 computer was sufficient. And they're wrong.
Yeah, if you look in the forums, we made a $500 computer and a $1,000 computer.
And a $3,000 computer.
Yeah, I didn't actually post the $3,000 computer because I didn't make it on Newegg. But let me tell you, a $3,000 computer has dual processor, badass, like 4 gigs of registered ECC memory, and like more hard drive space than, oh my god.
Yeah, I made a computer that wasn't exactly $3,000. I just went all out on it, like the ultimate crazy computer. And it was a little over $3,000, but it's more than any. It's a computer that no human being needs, basically. And even the $1,000 computer was excessive. We're like talking insane. The best video card available.
The $500 computer will play every game that is out now,
and games to come. It won't play them perfectly with all the settings turned all the way up.
Well, actually, a lot of them it will, just not Half-Life 2.
Yeah, it'll play new games like Half-Life 2 and I guess the new Fear game and whatever other new PC games at the medium normal quality with enough frames that you won't go, oh, my frame rate is low. So if you spend more than $500 for a computer, you better have some crazy use for it, like art.
Yeah,
or
like our
video
friend Kat
editing.
was like, I need an expensive computer because I do art.
Yeah, if you're doing art, you need computer. If you're doing 3D art, you need even more computer.
Yep.
If you're doing video editing, you need a lot of computer.
If you play Counter-Strike, you don't need computer.
If you're playing Counter-Strike, you need a $100 computer. Anyway.
So, this being part 2 of our ongoing series, last time we talked about how to pick what kind of computer you need, or, figure out your needs, basically. Now we're going to get into some of the more gritty details. The components. What is in a computer, and what do you need, why do you need it, and how do you pick a good one?
Well, the first and most important part is the motherboard.
The motherboard.
The motherboard is basically this big circuit board with a bunch of slots and plugs and holes in it. And it's basically, the purpose of the motherboard is to tie all the real parts of the computer together.
Everything in your computer plugs into the motherboard. Every component of your computer communicates with other components through the motherboard. The motherboard has thousands and thousands of circuits and things all over it.
Yep. In a way, the motherboard is the defining piece of your computer, but in another way, it is none of your computer, as it doesn't really do so much, except let other things talk across it.
It's just the connective tissue, basically.
Yep, but what motherboard you choose is probably the most important choice, because different motherboards can allow different things to be put into them. So you have to figure out what you want, and then you pick a motherboard that can hold what you want.
Yep. Luckily, motherboard buying is 1,000 times easier now than it was not like 4 or 5 years ago even.
Oh, God, it used to be a nightmare.
Because it used to be, it'd be like now, you look online, you want a motherboard. But every motherboard, because technology wasn't quite there yet, there were trade-offs. Like, oh, this one has 4 spots for memory, but it only has this many PCI slots.
Oh, yeah. Or it has, this one doesn't have ISA slots, this one does. This one has extra USBs, this one doesn't. This one has, and like in those days, like onboard sound was, it's like, do I really want it? Do I not? It's not as good.
Yeah, it wasn't as good. It didn't work. Onboard video, if
onboard
you found
video
it, was like the worst thing ever.
Onboard video used to be like a death sentence. It was a nightmare. Nowadays, it's much, much better. Every motherboard that I looked at recently when pricing out computers has been more than what I've wanted. I haven't found a single insufficient motherboard.
Also, the quality has gone up. It used to be that if you bought a cheap off-brand motherboard, odds were it just didn't work.
Yep. And
not like it was slow, but like literally your computer wouldn't boot, and you were fucked.
Yeah. And, like, the expensive motherboards were the only ones that actually supported all the features of things. Like, you couldn't get a motherboard that, like, let your CPU go as fast as it could go unless you bought the really, really fancy new ones. It really wasn't good in the olden days.
Yep. And also, there were a lot of undocumented random, like, if you happen to use this processor and this memory on this motherboard, you can't boot.
Yep.
All that's gone. Any motherboard that you can buy on Newegg will probably work just fine.
And as long as you fill it with the correct amount of parts and the parts fit, it's 99.9% guaranteed to work. Actually, I think I can only think of one case in which that won't happen, and it's nothing anyone should worry about.
So basically, I guess we'll get back to the motherboard periodically throughout this, because once again, the motherboard decides what you can buy, or what you buy decides what motherboard you need.
Mm-hmm.
But the main things to say are that, one, You probably want most motherboards that are worth a crap now have a sound card built into them.
Yep.
That's all you need. It is pretty much useless to buy a sound card. Sound cards are no longer an item that you need to purchase for a computer.
Back in the day, a sound card used to be like, if you didn't have one that went in a PCI slot or an ISA slot, the one that was built into the motherboard was like some piece of crap. Or if you bought like a Packard Bell computer, you would get a sound card and a modem and a video card all built into one card, and it was a piece of crap. And nowadays, the sound cards that are built into motherboards are about as good as sound cards get, and they're not. One that's put into a PCI slot is no better. You can only really get better if you buy a crazy professional sound card that's like external to the computer, and you only need that if you're like an audio professional.
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually thinking of getting a nice external Yamaha for doing this stuff for a number of reasons that I won't get into because you don't care about it. But if you're doing any sort of professional audio, you need a real sound card.
But if you're just a gamer or a normal PC user...
Sound blasters give you nothing. They take your money. They give you nothing in return.
Yeah, don't buy an Audigy. Don't buy anything. The one that's built into any of the motherboards that we'll tell you to buy, or pretty much any motherboard you buy these days that's a new modern motherboard with built-in sound, will let you do surround sound with nothing.
Yep.
And it doesn't cost you any extra money.
If you install Windows, it'll probably just have a driver and you won't even need to bother with it.
Yeah, it'll just work. Ding! Oh, look, you have surround sound and it works perfectly.
I mean, it used to be the conventional wisdom was buy a Sound Blaster. It's the standard, and it's the best, and it's the only way. But now, Sound Blaster is just audiophile. Not even audiophile. It's just rubbish.
Yeah.
They're just trying to take your money. Now, the other thing that will be on your motherboard is a network card.
Yep.
You don't need to buy a network card anymore. Any motherboard that's worth $1 or more has a network card built into it. It'll work fine.
There are even some motherboards that have 2 network cards built in. If you need 2 network cards, go for it. If not, it couldn't hurt. But
yep.
You're probably, if a motherboard has 2 network cards and you're not someone who needs 2, that might be a motherboard that's too much for you.
Yeah, we don't want to sound conceited, but if you can't think of a reason to have 2 network cards, you don't need 2 network cards.
Yeah, and if you do really need a whole bunch more network cards, you're probably just going to fill your PCI slots with like quadruple NICs and stuff.
Yeah.
So, but your motherboard should have a network card, and if possible, get one that supports gigabit Ethernet, because while you probably won't use it now, they're pretty easy to get motherboards with gigabit Ethernet on them.
They generally don't cost any more.
It doesn't cost any more, and it will help you in the future for sure. Right.
Now, motherboard needs a processor in it. You can't boot or anything without a processor.
The processor is probably the most important part of the computer. In fact, it is the computer.
It's also probably your easiest choice.
Yep.
1, buy an AMD.
Yeah, I can't tell you to buy an Intel and keep a straight face.
I mean, they're not bad chips. My Intel chips are very fast and very good, but they cost upwards of 4 times more, and they're not better.
Yeah, it's like an AMD that costs $100. The same an Intel chip that is the same power will cost 4 times more dollars.
I mean,
why would you buy the Intel? There's no reason.
See, because a lot of people have this impression, because it was true, 7 years ago, that Intel chips were better.
Because they were fighting against Cyrix.
I mean, back in the day, there were Cyrix chips, which, if you've ever heard of Cyrix, you probably had it associated with bad things. Cyrix is like the worst chip in the world.
I think they still make chips, but I don't think they make normal PC chips anymore.
Yeah. But then, AMD had the K6-3 and all that.
Yep.
And back then, Intel chips were significantly better, cooler, and faster.
Mm-hmm. I had a Pentium 3 back when the K6-2 was the only other option.
Yep.
But then when the K7, a.k.a. the original Athlon, came out, that was the beginning of the end for Intel.
I mean, it started out, Athlons, basically, they weren't as efficient as Intel chips, but they made up for it with raw horsepower.
Mm-hmm.
Now the tables have turned, and the AMD chips have more raw horsepower and are more optimized in most cases.
Yeah, and especially now, AMD has won the 64-bit war. And while at this very moment in time, no one really needs a 64-bit processor, and like hardly anyone actually has the 64-bit version of Windows, Linux, if you set it up right, will take advantage of your 64-bitness. But if you're going to buy a computer today, 64-bit is backwards compatible with the old 32-bit.
Yeah.
And in the future, it's going to help you out a lot as people start writing programs that take advantage. So you can't not get 64 bits unless you're really, really poor.
And even then, I mean, 64-bit chips are not significantly more expensive.
Yeah, you
You'd
can
be
get the
surprised.
low end 64-bit chips for the same price as the high-end 32-bit chips, which is almost nothing these days, relatively.
Now, there's one more complication here, and, well, there's two more, really. One, there's dual processors, or multiple processors. You don't need it. I'm telling you right now, you do not need more than one processor.
You might, if you're crazy, get a dual-core processor.
That's the other complication.
Yep.
A dual-core processor basically has two processor cores, which is essentially two processors on the same chip, the same processor.
Mm-hmm. So it's only one. To you, it looks like this one thing that you stick in your motherboard, but really it's two in there.
But while there's two in there, they share the same memory bandwidth going out to the rest of the PC.
Yep.
Which,
but,
there's more detail. I mean, we can't explain that without getting into very technical details.
mm-hmm.
But suffice to say, just think of it this way. People who don't know about computers, they say the computer and they point at their monitor. They say the PC and they point at the whole thing, or the processor, they point at the whole thing.
Or they say the hard drive and they point at the whole thing.
That's what a processor's like. What you think of as a processor, that thing you stick in your computer, is actually a core, which does all the processing, and a whole bunch of registers and memory and caches and all this stuff.
There's a bunch of tiny stuff all crammed in there. It's crazy.
But again, if you don't know about that and you don't care about that, dual core isn't going to help you that much either. And the dual cores are actually fairly expensive.
Yep. And let's see, the other thing you have to worry about when buying a processor is the socket.
Yep. But luckily, it's fairly simple. A socket will have a letter and a number, or sometimes just a number, but they're all unique, and you can't put the wrong thing into the wrong hole ever.
Yeah, so if by some miracle you buy a processor that won't fit in your motherboard, you just won't be able to put it in. You'll know if you can put it in because it'll just drop right in like easily.
Well, I take that back. There are exceptions to that, but you won't run into them because they're all old.
Yeah.
Real old.
Real old. So basically the choices for AMD these days are socket 754 and socket 939. There's a 940, but don't worry about it.
939 and 940 are essentially the same, other than some differences that, again, you don't care about.
940 is for servers. You don't need 940.
Yeah, that's multiple processor gobbledygook.
Yeah, so if you choose the 754, which is good if you're going for a bargain, you can use the Athlon. Let's see, the Athlon 64s, and I think some of the Semprons, and basically the lower half of the 64-bit line of chips will work in it. And all the newer chips are being made for 939, including the dual-core ones and all the others. So it doesn't really matter which one you get, if you're not going for like the crazy high-end chips, because you'll be able to get a chip in the range you want. The best chip that anyone needs, you can get one for the 754 socket.
But if you're thinking forward compatibility, 939, you'll have a more upgradable system in the long run.
Yeah, definitely 939 if you're more worried about power than money. 750, if you're looking for the save the money, 754 is your really only choice because the 939 only takes more expensive processors in it.
Now, basically, here we get to the point of how do you pick how fast a processor you need? Because honestly, buying the fastest processor you can afford is usually not the best option.
Well, I'll tell you what I do. There's two things I do. First, I look at benchmark charts on websites. Now, while benchmarks have all sorts of problems with them, and in that, someone rigged them, the system's not the same, it's under ideal conditions, not real working conditions, blah, 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 right? They have a graph. Now, I don't look at the numbers on the graph. I look at the curve of the graph. And where I tend to look is, you notice most of the graphs, when there's benchmarks, are sort of these exponential things, where towards the bottom, where the slower processors are, you're only getting tiny increases in power as you go up to the next chip. But when you get to the really high-up chips, you're getting these huge jumps in powers. Like, the difference between the most powerful chip and the second most powerful chip is a lot bigger than the difference between the slowest chip and the second slowest chip.
Usually, though. I mean, those graphs look different depending on what generation of chips you were in.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Because notice we're not talking about specific chips so much here. Mm-hmm. Because, really, that won't help you. If you buy a computer a month from now, it'll be different.
Yeah, it changes pretty much daily. There's so many different cores and megahertzes and numbers and things. It's just not helpful to try and say this is which one you need because...
Yeah. So just keep in mind, we're not telling you what to buy. We're telling you how to figure out for yourself what to buy.
Right. So what I do is I look at that graph, and I try to see which numbered chips are at the point where the exponential increase is about to start. Right in between the part where there's no real increases and the part where it goes crazy. Right before it goes crazy, I look at that number. Then I go back and I see what the prices are on those chips with numbers close to the number that was on the point in the graph. And you'll notice that the price tends to do the same thing. There's really not much of a price difference between the slow chip and the slightly faster slow chip. There's like maybe a few bucks difference. But as you get towards the part where the power is about to exponentially increase, you'll see the price will exponentially increase. It'll be like $98, $110, $130, $200, $300, $500, $1,000. I try to get the chip that's right before the price goes crazy because you don't have to pay that much more than the slower chip, and it's not that much slower than a chip that's crazy more expensive than it.
And then 6 months down the road, but what I always done, I use a slightly similar strategy, but I do it based on price solely. I buy pretty much the middle of the road chip that'll do everything I need it to do, or I buy the fastest one that I can afford or that I feel like I should spend the money on. But that's because I use my processor. We'll get into how much processor you actually need in a minute.
Yeah.
And then 6 months later, I buy the fastest chip, like the end-of-line chip, the last chip that'll fit in whatever socket I have in my motherboard when it gets cheap.
Yeah, like I had a socket A motherboard back in the... I have one now, actually, but they no longer really... Socket A is going out of style. But it has an XP 2500 in it. The fastest chip that can go in there is an XP 3200. That will never change because they're not making any more socket A chips really these days.
So you can always buy the maximal end-of-life chip for a motherboard, and then now you'll pretty much make that computer the best it could ever have been whenever you upgrade to the next computer on the road.
Yep, so now in maybe a few months, I'll buy the XP 3200 and replace the 2500. And the XP 3200 will cost me almost nothing because no one wants that chip anymore. It's a dead chip.
Yep.
Now, to figure out how much CPU you're using, well, if you're not doing something that's CPU intensive, like encoding video,
or editing WAV or video files,
or rendering 3D graphics,
compiling code,
or pretty much any of those things, you don't really need a powerful CPU.
I mean, you play games, your video card and your RAM are most of the performance in a game.
Yeah, when you're playing a game, the CPU is important because if it's too slow, it'll hold back your video card and your RAM. Like, let's say your video card is wicked fast and your CPU is wicked slow. Your video card will be doing all the work faster than the CPU sends it new work to do. But let's say your CPU is wicked fast, so much faster than your video card. It'll send the video card work at the rate at which the video card can do work, and then
all that extra speed is lost. It does nothing.
All that extra CPU power that you have doesn't do anything for your game. It's basically lost.
Because having more RAM can always help out with caching. Having more processor beyond what you use is absolutely 100% useless.
Yep. So you just want to figure out, how powerful is your video card. Get a chip that has the full front side bus speed of your motherboard and is as fast as you're willing to pay for, and you probably won't cause a bottleneck in your CPU.
Now, if you don't know what front side bus or anything we just said are, there's a simpler approach. Simply figure out how much you're willing to spend and buy the best processor you can reasonably accept.
Yep. And if after you add all your other components, or add all your other components first and do the CPU last, and say, all right, I'm $200 below my budget, get a $200 CPU.
Because honestly, if there's a $200 difference between the CPU you're looking at and the next one up, and you're not sure, build the rest of the computer first, and then see if that $200 is better spent buying a bunch of RAM or an awesome video card. Because processors are very easily upgraded. It's trivial.
Yep. All right. After the CPU, the next most important part is the RAM.
RAM is probably, in terms of performance, the most important thing. Basically, as much RAM as you can cram in there is always better.
Well, to a point, and it depends if you're running Windows or Linux a lot too.
Well, yeah, but basically with consumer motherboards, the kind of motherboards you're looking at, you'll max out the RAM on the motherboard before you'll hit the point of having more RAM is useless.
Well, let's talk about what RAM does for a second. RAM, whenever you're doing something on your computer, it's in the RAM. RAM is like, if you think of your brain as a computer, the RAM is where whatever you're thinking about right now is stored. So if you want to think about more things at once, or if you want to think about a really big thing, then you're going to need a lot of RAM.
Like we had some people who were talking about they want a computer that will multitask well, so they need a fast processor. Nope, that's not true. You need a lot of RAM. The fast processor doesn't matter so much.
Yep. Now, you know how sometimes if you're playing like a game is something big to think about. If it's a new game, it takes up a lot of RAM. And you want to switch from using that game to, say, your web browser. If you don't have a lot of RAM, then what your computer does is when it's out of RAM, it uses the hard drive, which we'll talk about, which is much slower than RAM.
Like orders of magnitude, multiple orders of magnitude slower.
Yeah, if you have a computer right now that's old, and while you're using it, it starts ticking like crazy, like that means you don't have enough RAM. And that's very, very bad. And if you put more RAM in that computer, it will improve the performance crazily. Like, insane increases in speed.
Like, I had a 486 back in the day with 4 megabytes of RAM. And one day, for $190, I bought another 4 megabyte chip and stuck it in. It was like night and day.
Yep.
The computer became a screaming beast.
Mm-hmm. So, you got to have enough RAM to do whatever the computer's thinking about. Now, if you use Windows, you're going to need more than if you use Linux.
Quite literally, almost double.
Yep.
Probably you need about 50% more RAM if you have a Windows
You need
machine.
100% more RAM if
Depending.
you're running Windows. But basically, with Windows, 512 megabytes of RAM is the minimum for doing anything. Anything at all. 256, it'll be a nightmare. Windows itself will take up the entire 256 megabytes of RAM, and that'll be the end of that. 512 will let you run Windows and a few programs or play one game at a time. You know, you can close everything and play a game with 512. I have 512, but I run Linux, and I bought my computer a while ago when 512 was awesome.
Yep.
In Windows, I got to recommend 1 gigabyte at the minimum, because with 1 gigabyte, you can play a game, watch a video, and like run GAIM and your web browser all at the same time, and you'll be all right. It won't be monstrous, but you'll be all right.
Yep. Now, for Linux, I'd recommend 1 gigabyte because, honestly, the price of another gigabyte is almost trivial compared to the benefit of having extra RAM.
Yeah. I mean, 512 in Linux will pretty much do anything you need to do if you're using a good Linux, configured properly. But to have a gig instead of 512 is just not that much more money, and it will help you.
I mean, like we talked about processors earlier, and the price curve is exponential. Every jump increases in price more than the previous increase. Unless you want an insane amount of RAM prices are linear. 1 gig, 2 gig, 3 gig, 4 gig, each gig costs the same amount as the previous gig.
Because you're buying a number of chips, and the price of one chip is the price of that chip. To buy 4 of them costs, they don't get more expensive when you buy more.
Yep. Now, you really... I mean, I said no amount of RAM is too much. Go all out. 4 gigabytes of RAM is ludicrous.
Yeah, and remember, you got to look at how much RAM your motherboard can hold. Some motherboards only have 2 slots, and you generally don't want to buy sticks that are bigger than 1 gig. So,
just because they're expensive.
Yeah, a single stick of RAM that has more than 1 gig of RAM memory on it is really kind of dumb to buy at this point in time. And... if you have a 2-slot motherboard, it'll probably say in the motherboard specification, max RAM 2 gigs, max RAM maybe 3 gigs. Maybe it can take 1.5 gig sticks, but you don't want to buy those unless they become cheap someday.
Yep. Now, luckily, most motherboards you look at will have 3 or 4 DIMM slots for RAM.
I would recommend buying a motherboard with 4 slots because that way... even if you only use 2 of the slots or 1 of the slots right now...
it's so easy to upgrade RAM.
Yeah, in the future, if something happens, you can just buy more RAM and stick it in those slots and you're good to go. And it's cheap.
And when you install new RAM, like say you upgrade later, you don't have to do anything. Your computer just knows.
You literally just turn your computer off, put the chips in the slots, then turn your computer back on. And that's it.
There are actually problems with Windows. If I forget the exact limit because I stopped using Windows, but I run into this a lot at work. I think it's 2 gigabytes, but if you want more than 2 or so gigabytes of RAM in Windows, you actually have to flip something in the registry or it won't do anything.
In Linux, I think that's a problem too, but it's only if you have more than 4 gigs of RAM. There's something in the kernel. But if you're using Linux where you have to manually configure your kernel, will that be a problem?
Yeah.
Like Gen 2.
Now, there are a million different kinds of RAM, different PC numbers and CAS latency numbers, and all these numbers that you really probably don't want to learn about.
Yep.
They're good to learn about, but you don't need to.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, you're going to pick your motherboard. Whatever your motherboard says it takes, buy that.
Yeah, if your motherboard says it takes 168-pin DDR400 DIMMs, get 168-pin DDR400 DIMMs.
And read the manual or read the specs on your motherboard. Some motherboards will say things like, you can have up to 1 gigabyte of unregistered or 2 gigabytes of registered.
Yep.
Make sure you pay attention to that.
Do whatever it says. Don't get... they sell this RAM, I see, in places like DDR600 RAM. I've never seen a motherboard that takes DDR600 RAM. That's really only for crazy overclock game nuts who think they're getting something, or maybe a potential future computer that might go that fast. But it's just silly. Whatever your motherboard says, buy that and buy the right number of gigs.
Yep, and don't never think that you can outsmart the motherboard. It knows.
It definitely knows.
Now, the only thing that really you might have a question about, because it'll come up a lot now, especially as RAM increases, is that there are 3 basic kinds of RAM, of modern RAM. I'm not getting all the old stuff. There is registered, there is ECC, and there is just normal RAM.
Mm-hmm.
ECC, you don't need to worry about. No consumer motherboard that I know of uses it. It's this error correction thing that's really only useful for expensive, powerful servers. Mm-hmm. And ECC RAM costs almost double normal RAM.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes ECC RAM would be helpful. Like my parents' computer recently had a RAM problem, and if they had had ECC RAM, they wouldn't have had that problem. But it's just so much easier to go, oh, I found out that the RAM is broken because I ran the memory checking program. Let me, take the RAM stick out and get them a new one. And that's that. Now,
registered is, to not go into detail on it, basically, if you have a lot of RAM, it has to be registered. Otherwise, your motherboard can't address it in an efficient manner. And either it won't recognize the rest of your RAM, or your RAM performance will degrade.
Mm-hmm.
Now, usually the motherboard will warn you, but a nice rule is, if you go over 2 gigabytes, you must use registered RAM, no matter what the motherboard says.
Yeah, even if the motherboard says you can use unregistered in large quantities, just get registered if you're going all out on RAM. And if you really need RAM, like you're doing some photoshopping where you're going to have a big picture in the RAM and you're going to be doing all kinds of stuff to it, get registered RAM. It will help you a lot.
Plus, even if you're only getting a gig now, if you get registered, it'll be a lot easier to upgrade to, 4 gigs later on.
Yep, absolutely. Now,
and also, if you have 4 slots and you want to have 2 gigs of RAM, buy 2 1-gig sticks. That way you still have 2 slots free.
Yeah,
Don't buy 4 512s, then upgrading sucks.
Yeah, well, the thing about the number of sticks to buy is that on certain motherboards, especially the N-Force NVIDIA motherboards, which I would recommend highly, there is a feature called dual channel, which only activates... It's activated automatically if you have enough sticks of RAM. But basically, if you have 2 or more sticks of RAM of the same size and you put them into your computer, the dual channel feature will be enabled if the motherboard decides that you have the correct RAM to do so.
It's just a performance-enhancing thing.
Yeah, so what you'll see a lot when you're buying RAM are these paired sticks. It'll be like... buy 2, it'll be like you only add 1 thing to your cart, but it'll be like 2x512. That means 2 512 megabyte sticks of RAM that are in a pair, so if you put those into your computer together, they'll be dual channel.
Because that is one thing, even though memory for AMD-based motherboards don't require it, usually it's a good idea to always buy your memory in sets of 2.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least always buy from the same manufacturer and of the same type.
Yep.
You don't want to mix like Crucial and Corsair in the same motherboard. It's not technically wrong, and you probably won't have a problem, but it's just not a good idea.
Mm-hmm. And the paired sticks are actually from the same lot. They were chips that were made right after each other, and they go together. So it's the tiniest bit better.
Now, there's also a slight downside to that. If there was a problem with that lot, then both your RAM are going to fail at the same time.
Yeah, but RAM does have a warranty, so you're okay then. But you're going to have maybe a problem in your computer if they both die 5 years later and you still have the computer.
Yeah, but by then you can buy whatever old RAM you needed for nothing.
But basically, if you want 1 gig of RAM and you know that's what you need, buy 2 512 meg sticks in a pair. If you need 2 gigs of RAM, buy 2 1 gig sticks. Don't go buying a single 1 gig stick and that's it, because it won't be as good as the 2 512s performance-wise in most cases.
So in general, in this current time, and of course this changes rapidly, get at least a gig.
Yep.
2 gigs is real nice.
2 gigs if you're a heavy Windows user.
Yeah, or if you're, multimedia, 3D, whatever.
Yep.
Or if you really, really multitask.
Yeah.
And I don't mean having Firefox and a couple tabs and GAIM open. I mean having, multiple extensive applications open.
And if you're a Linux desktop user, 1 gig is really all you need, and more than that won't help you unless you go nuts. Like, really nuts.
Or if you do crazy things like make a RAM disk and install things to it.
Yeah, you can do crazy stuff like that. That's fun.
Yep.
Oh, if you're using VMware or anything like that, you're going to need a lot of RAM.
Yes, VMware or virtualization or Plex 86 or anything like that.
Yeah, I would go so far as to say if you're using VMware daily, that you should have as much RAM as your motherboard can hold, because it would just make it that much better for you.
Now, hard drives.
The hard drive is where you put all your stuff.
Now, this is complicated, and basically I want to break this up into 2 sections. One, there's the hard drive or drives that you install your operating system and your programs on.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is mass storage. And by mass storage, I mean things you don't change often. Things like your MP3 collection that you're just adding to. Or all those Futurama episodes you downloaded. All your data that isn't directly related to applications and operating system.
All right.
Because basically on any computer beyond a computer that has 1 or 2 hard drives in it, you're going to need to separate the two or you're going to have trouble down the road.
Yeah, if you've got a pile of MP3s and videos on the same partition on the same hard drive as your operating system, operating systems change and people upgrade things and fool around with things, and drives with operating systems on them get a lot of use and get read and write data to a lot, which means they're probably going to fail. And if all your MP3s are on there with it, that's not the safest thing in the world.
And we're not trying to scare you. Hard drives fail more often than you think. They fail scarily often.
They fail more often than any other part of the computer.
I'm holding in my hand a dead hard drive.
Because they have moving parts.
Not only that, but hard drives are actually getting less reliable as they get more advanced.
And the bigger the hard drive is, the less reliable it is.
Yes. Also, if it's a Maxtor or a Seagate and see, here's the thing I'll get into now. You're going to hear from people that, don't buy so-and-so brand of hard drive, they're bad. Don't buy this brand, they failed on me. Every brand is that way. You really can't win.
Yeah, no matter what brand. If you talk to someone, they'll say, this is the brand that crashed on me, then I switched to this brand, and it didn't crash on me. It's all random, pretty much, except for Western Digital. They suck.
Yeah, they're better now. They used to be real bad. The old Western Digital caviar drives.
And IBM Death Stars used to suck, but they no longer make those.
Yeah, Seagate used to be, crazy good. Now they're still good, but they're not infallible.
Yes, Seagate was never infallible, but I would still recommend Seagate. But I can't honestly say that Maxtor or those other brands are really worse.
Yeah, you're looking more for the specs on the hard drive and the speed. Don't worry so much about the brand. Because it really, really doesn't matter.
As long as you don't get weirdo brand hard drives, which are really hard to find because there aren't so many hard drive manufacturers these days.
Yep. So basically a Maxtor, a Seagate, an old IBM, though you don't really want old hard drives. Never buy a used hard drive.
No, unless you're digging for old people's data and not trying to use a hard drive for daily use that for you.
Yep.
Buy brand new hard drives. They try to get ones that have 3-year warranties. If they're only giving you a 1-year warranty, that means they don't have confidence in that drive.
The thing is, almost every company gives you a 1-year warranty.
No, nowadays Seagate gives you the 3-year.
Yeah, Seagate does. Other people don't.
Yeah. It's all right. So
now, there used to be the argument back in the day on hard drives was, do I get IDE or do I get SCSI? Well, the answer to that is serial ATA.
Yep. recently, and on all motherboards that you will buy today, unless you buy a weird motherboard that you shouldn't be buying for a desktop, it will have serial ATA. Now, remember in the olden days, you used to have these big fat cables. They would be really flat and wide, and that's what you would connect your hard drives to your computer with. And SCSI was the same way, only it was fatter and wider.
Yeah, well, SCSI was a lot different in ways that you really don't. I don't want to get into the details.
Back in the day, your choice was basically between really awesome hard drives that were really expensive and work differently,
SCSI,
and hard drives that work normally and cost the normal amount but weren't so awesome.
IDE.
Now we have this thing called serial ATA, which is fast, awesome, and cost normal price.
It combines all the awesome of old SCSI, like SCSI 2 and back, with all the ease of use of IDE.
Yep. So if you don't buy a motherboard that has serial ATA and serial ATA hard drives for a desktop computer, I have no idea what you're thinking.
Unless you're going super cheap.
Yeah,
like you're making a bare bones tiny computer for your grandma.
Yeah, every motherboard I saw had support for 4 serial ATA devices and 4 old school IDE devices.
And you still want the old school IDE capability.
Because you might come across a drive that is only old school IDE and you might want to plug it in.
Also, a lot of things like CD-ROMs and various other things, a lot of them aren't serial ATA because they don't need it.
Yeah, but there are serial ATA CD-ROMs, and if you really want to not have ribbon cables in your computer, it might be worth it to buy one. But anyway, serial ATA is the way to go. You have to look at your motherboard, which will either be serial ATA 150, which is normal, or serial ATA 2, a.k.a. serial ATA 300, which is just twice as fast, theoretically, on paper. And depending on whatever your motherboard has, that's the kind of drive you want to buy.
Yes. However, if you have the faster one, it's backward compatible.
Yep.
So you can buy a cheap, slower drive.
So if you have a motherboard that has fancy serial ATA, but you don't want to buy a fancy drive, just buy the normal serial ATA drive, and you're good.
Now, there aren't many choices when it comes to specs of hard drives other than how big they are.
Yep.
But the choices that you'll see, and this is important because it matters, there is RPMs, or how fast the drive spins. This is directly related to its speed and its reliability. The faster it spins, the faster the data can come off of it, and the more likely the drive is to fail.
Yep. You'll see crazy like 10,000, 15,000 RPM drives for servers and things and whatnot. 7,200 RPM has pretty much been the standard for how fast a consumer desktop hard drive should be.
Yes. Also, you really only see faster drives on SCSI.
Yep. And that's what I can recommend to buy to you. That's what I buy. That's what's been in every computer for years and years.
Yep, but 5400 has a use, which we'll get into.
Yep.
Now, since I said we're gonna split this up, first, if you're building a computer, you need somewhere to put the operating system and the applications and everything.
Mm-hmm.
You have 2 basic options: either buy 1 hard drive or buy 2 hard drives.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you buy 1 hard drive, you buy a hard drive, you install everything on it. That's that.
Yep.
If you buy 2, most motherboards now that are serial ATA give you RAID options.
Mm.
Now, RAID is the key. RAID was something that only a few years ago was out of the reach of most people.
It was only for like big companies who had tons and tons and tons of data that they needed to put someplace to be very, very safe.
RAID has suddenly and powerfully come into the mainstream, and you want it.
And it's pretty cheap, too.
It's cheap, and even if it wasn't that cheap, it's worth the money now, especially with the amounts of data that people store.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for the operating system, you'll have to read the manual on your motherboard to learn how to set up the RAID, but it's actually really, really easy. But I recommend that no matter what computer you build, you buy 2 hard drives, and you can either RAID 0 or RAID 1 them.
Mm.
There are all these different numbers of RAID, but 0 and 1 are generally the only ones that your motherboard is going to support.
Yep.
0 gives you, it basically combines the 2 drives into one big super fast drive called a stripe.
If you're someone who needs lots and lots of performance, like you have lots and lots of video editing going on, but you can live with it if maybe the drive's crashed because you're smart and you back up on an external drive or a server somewhere.
Yep.
But you're editing video, which means if you can read it off the drive faster, you can edit it faster and work faster. RAID 0 is what you want.
RAID 0 stripes can give you up to about 40% increases in speed because it can read and write to both disks simultaneously.
Yep, it's very, very good.
Now, there's a major drawback to this. If one of the drives fail, all the data's gone from both drives irrecoverably.
Yep. Unless you go to some data recovery specialist.
That costs more than a new computer would cost.
Yeah, I would not recommend going to them unless you're a company and the money and the data on those drives is worth more money than it costs to recover it.
Now, for an operating system, RAID 0 is fine because theoretically, as long as you're storing your data, all the files that you save that aren't an application somewhere else, the worst case, you lose the array. You buy a new drive, you replace it, and you reinstall your operating system and all your programs.
Mm-hmm.
That's not that difficult. Even in Windows, it's really not that much of a pain.
Yeah, the only data you have to worry about losing, if you're worried about reliability, it should only be because of data that cannot be replaced. Software that is installed, things that you can download from the internet again, things that are on CDs. Don't worry if your hard drive crashes and that's all that's on there because you can just put it on there again.
Now, the other option is RAID 1, and this option is more expensive. In fact, it's twice as expensive per megabyte.
Mm-hmm.
RAID 1, if you have 2 drives, you only get 1 drive worth of space, and it makes a copy of that entire drive to the other drive at all times.
But if one of the drives crash,
you're fine. All you do is turn the computer will work just as normal. It'll say, hey, I lost a drive. And whenever you feel like it, you turn the computer off, you take the dead drive out, you put a new drive in, and it rebuilds all the data on the new drive, and you have a backup again.
Yep. I would recommend using RAID 1 if you have lots and lots of, say, documents for your home business.
Or if it's really worth it to you to, no matter what happens to your hard drives, you won't have to ever reinstall or rebuild your computer.
Yep. Some people, they have important data. Maybe say you have all the emails of your entire life on your hard drive because maybe you switched email servers or, you have something special. And instead of, backing up onto tapes or external hard drives or things, which is, an intensive manual, possibly daily procedure that you have to go through the trouble of automating, a RAID 1, just boop, you're safe.
Now, there are 2 more options, and we don't have to go into great detail on them. One is no RAID at all, just have a disk.
Yep.
Or, JBOD, which is the acronym for just a bunch of disks.
Yeah, that's what it really stands for.
Yeah, seriously, it'll say that on the boxes. If you see JBOD and you're confused by it, it doesn't mean anything.
Just a bunch of disks.
Yeah, literally. But if you have just a disk, that's fine. No RAID, you just install your operating system on it. But once again, just like a RAID 0, if that drive goes, you lose all your data.
Yep.
And then there's RAID 0+1, which, to simplify greatly, is a RAID 0 of RAID 1s, or a RAID 1 of RAID 0s. Mm-hmm. So you need 4 disks to do that, and you lose the space on 2 of them, and you get crazy performance and full backup all the time.
Yep, but you need to buy extra disks.
4 drives to get the space on 2 of them.
Yeah.
Now, basically, if you have a large collection of data, like beyond some Office files, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of gigabytes of data, MP3s, whatever, you need a separate storage solution.
Maybe another computer with a bunch of hard drives in it, or some sort of box full of hard drives that is outside of your computer and attached to your computer by another means.
Or in your computer in a separate RAID.
Mm-hmm.
So just because there's so many options, here's a nice example. You have one hard drive connected to your serial ATA. Mm-hmm. That hard drive has your operating system and all your applications installed on it. It's a 7,200 RPM fast drive. Maybe you have 2 of them and you make it a stripe, but it doesn't matter. Your operating system, your applications are on these fast drives. Now you buy a RAID card and you stick it in a PCI slot. RAID cards aren't that expensive. About $100 will get you a decent one. A RAID card lets you do the other numbers of RAID, because I said 0 and 1. There's also 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 11, 55, and a whole bunch of them.
Yeah.
Now, RAID 5, I'm really going to skip a lot here. You want RAID 5. RAID 5 gives you very good speed increases, 20 to 30% in many cases, which is almost as much as a pure stripe, a pure RAID 0. But at the same time, you get redundancy, which is almost as good as a RAID 1. Basically what it does is, for how many, say you have N drives, you'll get N minus 1 drives worth of space, and that last drive holds parity information, with which, if any one of the drives in the array dies, you can use that parity to recreate all the data on the lost drive.
So if you have 5 drives and one of them crashes, you're still okay because you can replace it and if you wait a while, eventually all the data on that drive will reappear.
Now, technically, what I said was a RAID 3, because a RAID 5 just means that the parity is distributed among all the disks, and it's kind of complicated. Don't worry about it. RAID 5 is what you want. Most things don't even bother with RAID 3 anymore.
Yep.
And basically, you buy 4 drives, make a RAID 5 of them, stick them on a RAID card, and then put all your data there.
Now, you can make a RAID 5 with 3 drives. So if you're really cheap and you don't really need that much space, let's say you buy some crazy motherboard that supports RAID 5 and has 4 serial ATA connectors, you can buy 4 drives, use one of them for your OS, and then 3 of them for a RAID 5.
Which is a very good idea.
Yeah, but the motherboards that support RAID 5 are very hard to come by, so you might be paying an extra up to $100 for that motherboard. But it could be worth it if you're definitely going to go this route.
Now, also keep in mind, hard drives are cheap. You can buy a 250, 300 gigabyte hard drive for very little money comparatively.
Yeah, and there's sales occasionally these days where you can see stuff like 200 gigabyte hard drive, $40, limit 1 per person. So if you get a bunch of your friends, you can buy a bunch of these things for nothing.
So don't skimp on hard drives. Back up your data. I don't know how much more I can stress that.
Yep.
Most people don't back up at all, and they don't seem to realize that hard drives die often, and you'll lose everything.
Yep.
Imagine if you lost every MP3 you had.
Well, there is one thing, is that some people, they don't download lots of MP3s, or maybe they use like the iTunes Music Store, in which case, if they've already bought a song and they still have their account, they can download it again. And maybe they don't have so many applications, so they don't need to use a lot of space for them. And they don't download a lot of movies, or maybe they stream a lot of movies, or they store all their music and movies on their iPod, not on their computer. If you're one of these people who doesn't really need lots of hard drive space at all, just get one hard drive, like an 80 gig hard drive, and put your operating system on it, and that's that. You don't have to worry about any of this crap. But
if you have data, you need somewhere safe to put it.
Yeah, I mean, also, if the only data you have is a few Excel files or a few Word documents, you can get one of those little USB little tiny drives that you just stick in, and you can put all your data on that, or maybe, copy your My Documents folder to it and take it around with you.
Well, because Penny Arcade made this mistake. If you have a backup drive, it's a backup. That means the data is also somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. So
you save it to your hard drive, and you periodically copy it to the other drive. You don't just put it all on that other drive, because then if that drive fails, you're just as fucked.
Yep. You have to gauge how much data you have, how much data you're going to have, how much space all your stuff takes up, and whether it's worth it to buy a big RAID that can maybe hold 600 gigs of data, or if you're only going to have 80 gigs of stuff, and it's just stupid for you to spend money on that. But always know that unless you have some sort of system of backing up or rating, that your data is in a precarious position.
Yep. And if your data is on the same disk as your operating system, even more precarious.
Very precarious. All right.
So we've talked a long time about this, and I guess that means that our series is going to continue next week, next Monday, with part 3, where we'll get into picking a video card, which will probably be a whole show unto itself.
The video card isn't so complicated.
Well, I guess we'll do a video card and all the other peripherals. Video card, monitors, and CRTs if you need things like that.
DVD burners,
which is kind of complicated now.
It's not as complicated as it was a few months ago.
Yeah, because luckily things have kind of solidified.
Yep. Floppy drives, which are no longer needed.
Yeah, though they're still kind of useful, but the thing is they're expensive now, which is kind of surprising.
Oh, and of course, the boxes that you put your computer in.
Yes, and probably the most neglected and yet most critical component of all, the power supply.
Yep.
You don't think anything of the power supply. The power supply is just the thing that you plug it in and it works. The power supply can make or break your system. Too weak a power supply can destroy your motherboard.
Too weak a power supply and your computer won't even work.
Yeah.
I had that problem.
So we'll get into all that next Monday. Stay tuned. And we out.
Fair. Up here.
And that was Geeknights with Rim and Scott. Special thanks to DJ Pretzel for the opening music.
Thanks for listening. Please remember to point your favorite podcatcher at feeds.feedburner.com/geeknights to get the latest episodes as soon as they're released. Also, please visit our website at www.frontrowcrew.com for the latest updates and forum discussions. And whether you love or hate our podcast, we won't know unless you send your feedback to us at geeknights@gmail.com.